It's election day, and that's a good feeling. More than 2 million people voted already in North Carolina over our 17-day early voting period. But today is the last day to make your voice heard. Welcome to the Daily Download. I'm Travis Fain, and today we're talking about election integrity. That's a buzz phrase you'll hear a lot of times from conspiracy theorists, unfortunately. But reporters and a raft of officials and academics and activists and politicians have been studying the integrity of our elections for decades. And today I'm joined by Laura Leslie, WRAL's State Capitol Bureau Chief. Together, Laura and I have more than 40 years experience covering elections, and, we feel pretty darn good about that process. Laura, welcome.
Well, thanks for having me.
Yeah, and thanks for joining us. All right, folks, look, it is absolutely reasonable to have questions about elections or anything else your government does. What is not reasonable is to continue pushing bogus claims after they are obviously bogus. After the presidential elections in 2020, former President Donald Trump supporters filed more than 60 lawsuits making various claims about election processes in various states. They were dismissed. 86 judges were involved, according to a count by the Washington Post. 38 of those judges appointed by Republicans. There's quite a bit of evidence, too, that Team Trump, based on emails released in a federal court proceeding, that Team Trump and the president himself knew he was pushing false claims all the way back in 2020. But Laura, some people can't be convinced, and some of them have been pretty active leading into this election season. Tell us about a project you've been doing, NC Votes 101.
Sure. So, I was at a training session where we were talking about this particular thing, the seminar. And, one of the things that was brought up that I thought was really true is that elections tend to be a black box. And part of the reason for that is that election officials obviously want to keep things secure. They can't have people wandering around elections buildings, like rifling through ballots. And so, but most people just don't really have any idea of the back end, what it looks like on the back end as all these ballots are being, processed, counted, stored, approved, cast, So this series was sort of meant to demystify voting. So I started with how do you request an absentee ballot, and what happens when you do, right? What does it look like? How does it show up? And then how do you fill it out correctly? And then what happens to it after you send it in? What do they do with that, right? Also covered things like accuracy testing to make sure that's how you know that those voting machines are counting your votes correctly. They're not switching your person, your votee there. There are some places that use touchscreens. North Carolina is not one of them. We do have some touchscreen voting for people who for voters with disabilities, but even our touchscreen vote machines have to make a paper ballot, even if it's just like a strip of paper.
Yeah, they produce a paper record. They print it out after you use the machine to vote.
Yeah, there's no sort of pure electronic voting in North Carolina. So that does kind of help to reduce the chances of that happening. And then we talked about how and when mail-in votes get counted, and what happens, partisan observers, what's their role, what isn't their role. Misinformation that shows up in your mailbox, because there's plenty of that, how you know that there's no counterfeit ballot. So all these are available on the WRAL website under the NC Votes 101 tag. You can find the whole series of those.
Yeah, walk us briefly through the anti-counterfeiting measures on the paper ballots. I found that really interesting.
Oh, thanks. I did too, because one of the claims that we heard, I think out in Arizona especially, was that there were some counterfeit ballots introduced by the Chinese or somebody. And there was the Cyber Ninjas group, I think it was looking for traces of bamboo in the paper. Of course, that never amounted to anything, which you could say about pretty much all the ballot, the election fraud claims. But it would be awfully, awfully hard to counterfeit a ballot in North Carolina. Part of the reason is, when they send you an absentee ballot, for example, they know who they're sent it to, right? So, and there's barcodes on that link to a unique identifier. So nobody can look at that and know that it's you, but if they needed to track it down, they probably could. They could certainly get a lot of information about exactly where it was sent to and when. Another thing that they do, it's a special kind of paper, right? It's got a special kind of computer coding on the side of it, and that's what's required for the machine to read it. If it's the wrong whiteness, if it's the wrong reflectivity, if it's the wrong makeup of the paper, like cotton versus linen versus bamboo, for example, the machines wouldn't read it. So, you couldn't just sort of counterfeit them. And then even if you did counterfeit them, how would you get them in, right? Because they'd have to be counted at some point. And the ballot cage, when you have ballots that are not cast yet and ballots that are already cast, that's really securely locked up. And it's got, at least in Wake County here, it's got a floor to ceiling sort of barrier chain link. It's got security cameras. It's got motion detectors that go to the police station. It's got several layers of badge access. It's really restricted. And even among the Board of Election staff, only a couple people actually have access to that ballot cage. So I don't know how you would get the counterfeit ballots into the count, even if you did manage to come up with plausible counterfeit ballots.
And in North Carolina, those paper ballots are kept for 22 months after an
For
election.
federal elections, yeah.
For federal elections.
Yeah.
If your latest story looked at the possibility that an election can be hacked, that computer hackers can come in and change things. Tell us what you found there, and tell us what air gapped means and how that's relevant here.
Sure. So if you do IT or anything like that, you know that an air gap basically means you've got a machine that is not connected in any way to anything else, right? And you know it's air gap because it has no doesn't have a modem, or it doesn't have wireless capabilities, doesn't have Bluetooth, isn't connected to anything. It's a standalone machine. So that air gap protects that machine from being hacked, right? Because there's no way for external forces to get into it, as long as there's no preloaded malware or anything like that on it, right? So that essentially is part of how our systems work. All of our voting machines are air gapped. They are not connected. There is no modems. They have no connectivity. So on election night or at the end of voting, what they do is they get the results off of them on a thumb drive. And this is not like, it was Carrie Brazel said, this is not the one you get at Target. It's a special, secured thumb drive. And they have to drive that thumb drive physically over to the county elections office along with those paper ballots. And then they have a computer there that is also air gapped. And that's where they load in all of these thumb drives from all these precincts and tabulate everything, right? Come up with it. And then when that's done on that computer, which is not connected to the internet, then they take that another thumb drive and they move that to a computer that is connected so they can upload those results securely to the state website with multi-factor authentication. But you have to remember, like every step of this, there's a duplicate copy before it ever moves on to the next step, right? So there's a really clear chain of custody here in terms of what the data were on this computer versus what the data were on this computer. So, I mean, the odds, even if somebody could hack something, it would become pretty obvious pretty quickly because those different images of that data wouldn't match.
And the process Laura described there with the flash drives coming home to be counted, that's why final election results or final unofficial election results, at least on election night, take a while because they're literally driving things.
Right.
We used to transmit by modem, though, right? And they stopped doing that. And I think in 2021 or so, we found out that some older voting machines in some counties, I think 6 counties in North Carolina, still had modems. All disabled now, right?
Right. They were all disabled in the first place because they didn't have the software needed to connect to anything. But it was one of those that they had gone to these machines. I think these were bought in the mid 2000s, and the modem sort of came with them because that's what people were doing. Because of course it got you your results a lot faster. I know you remember, and I remember, being an election night, and as soon as the polls close, you start, they'd start sort of dribbling in as these results were uploaded from different precincts. It's not that way anymore, and that changed. I think it was in 2016 was the last time we did that. And it changed in 2018 is I think when they started not using the modems at all to get those results. So yeah, it takes a lot longer on election night than it used to get those results. But what the trade-off here is that that they're secure, that they're not being transmitted on modems that could let hackers into voting machines or tabulators.
Yeah, and just to walk people through quickly what to expect on election night. So the polls close 7:30. We count the early vote because we've had more than 2 million people already vote. That will hit the state's website and then various media websites pretty quickly after that. And then it'll be a couple hours maybe as we count the people who voted on election day. And then is it 3 days still that people have to have their absentee ballots, if they were postmarked on election day, arrive and be counted? So there will
It's
be
actually a little bit more than that this year because the Friday after the election this year, because it's so late, is Veterans Day. It's the 11th. So what they decided to do was to make Monday the final day because there's no mail Friday. So they wouldn't be able to, it would have to it still has to be postmarked by election day, but it will have to arrive by that Monday in order to be counted. And there's also votes that come in late from overseas. You have overseas voters and military voters, and state law provides for those to have a little extra time to come in and be counted too. And there's also provisional ballots, right? Because people will vote at early voting sites or at their website. Maybe your name is John Doe and somebody else is John Doe, and somebody marked off the wrong John Doe, and it looks like you already voted, but you didn't, right? You'd be allowed to cast a provisional ballot. And then in that 10 days after the election, which is called the canvass period, that's when election officials have that period of time to do those post-election audits, to sort through all those provisional ballots, right? To figure out which ones are legit and should be counted, which ones are not. Because a lot of people just think they're registered and maybe they're not. They show up, they get a provisional ballot, but in that interim period, the staff there at the Board of Elections does the research to figure it out, right? So that's why there's, a lot of times when races aren't very close, these last minute ballots are just a trickle. There's a fraction of a percent of the voting. So they don't always make a difference, but in a very close race, they can.
Right. So most of the results pretty quickly after polls close at 7:30. Almost all the results by the end of the night as the flash drives come in, and then the remaining absentee ballots, provisionals, few days after that, and then the canvassing period to finalize the election. All of that is normal. And remember, in other states, they got other rules. For example, Pennsylvania doesn't count their absentee votes until on election day. So you might see other states be later than North Carolina. All very normal. Don't worry about it.
Just a quick note, we didn't used to either. It was just a couple of years ago that our legislature approved for county boards to be able to start counting the absentee ballots early. So that is something that a lot of states are looking at us for as sort of a model state for how they should do it next time.
Certainly a blessing for those of us watching it in real time on election night. We'll take a quick break. We're going to come back, talk more with Laura Leslie. All right, welcome back to the Daily Download. We're talking the rules of voting in North Carolina and how confident you can feel. We feel you can be very confident in the process. But like I said, when I opened the show, you might have heard about the election integrity movement. People tied most of them to President Trump's failed bid to overturn the 2020 presidential election, including a woman, an attorney named Cleta Mitchell, who actually lives in North Carolina. She was heavily involved in the former president's efforts. She has helped establish something here called the Election Integrity Network. Jim Womack, who is a county GOP chair, people who've been around North Carolina politics for a while might know him. He is heading up some of those efforts. They've been training poll watchers. Look, poll watching is a really normal process, y'all. There are Republicans, there are Democrats, there are all these people. When you go to the polls, count the number of people that are just kind of there making sure things go well, whether they're volunteers or paid election workers. It's a lot. But we did have some kind of heightened concerns this year, Laura, that things might get a little wacky. People might try to intimidate voters. People might try to get a little too close. It seems to have been relatively quiet, knock on wood, at least as of Friday when we checked with the State Board of Elections. They were only tracking about 14 incidents of possible harassment, intimidation.
Right. And I mean, I do want to distinguish here. So there's partisan observers, right? And those are part of the election process, a part of the election law in North Carolina. So each party gets to have like up to 3, I think, observers in a precinct. They are there to watch and to observe. If they have questions, they can ask a judge if they think something looks like it's wrong. But they are not there to confront voters or to ask questions of voters or to take pictures or to get themselves into positions where they can see people's ballots. And there were some problems with that in the May primary this year. That is part of the reason they were concerned about it this fall, because they said that there seems to have been this sort of organized effort to get people in who were election skeptics, anybody can serve, right? Anybody can serve as an observer, and that's what sort of a lot of these sort of election deniers were counting on. But the election judges are there to get a job done, right? Which is to administer the election. So they can't spend their entire time talking to the folks who are the observing about what's going on. And this is kind of crucial. The state doesn't train these folks. It's the political parties that are in charge of training these observers. So folks that have done this for a long time, they kind of know what's normal and what's not normal and things, what should jump out at you, right? But folks who have never done this before and aren't familiar with the workings of the system, everything looks suspicious, right? So they had a lot of people asking questions and sort of getting confrontational. Somebody actually trying to block a voter from putting their ballot into a tabulator in one place. In this election cycle, so far, we seem to have had some issues mostly with people outside the polls, right? So those people are not poll watchers per se. They're not partisan observers, right? Their name is not on a list anywhere. They sort of go to work for one campaign or another, and they sometimes take pictures of people, sometimes yell at people. They're not supposed to. Intimidation is illegal. Voter intimidation is, but we have heard some reports of that, and we also heard reports of a couple of election workers in Columbus County being stalked and followed home. And this is just this election too. So there's some concerns about that.
Yeah, the two incidents it looks like in Columbus County where someone was followed from the polling site. That's a concern. The state is looking into it. Was my last update on that. If anyone does try to intimidate you at the polls, tell the election staff there that is part of, that is illegal, and people that these things are taken seriously.
Right, and they can't get in your way either. I mean, there's a buffer of 50 feet that's around, as you go into the voting place, and they cannot be inside. Nobody who is involved in campaigns on either side in any way can be inside that buffer. Even the media can't really be inside that buffer. That is supposed to be sacrosanct for the voters to get in and out easily. So, something to keep in mind as you're going in and out. I don't think people need to be real worried about this because we have not seen a huge outbreak of this time. But, I think there are certainly cases in which people have reported feeling intimidated by people who are just hanging out at the polls. So that's something to keep in mind.
Right. And there are a number of hotlines too. The ACLU usually does one, various groups that, hey, if you see a problem at the polls, tell the elections officials and tell us too. Sunshine is a wonderful thing. One of the other stories you did, voting tabulators. That's the machines that count the Scantron paper form. They do accuracy testing before an election. You covered that process in Wake County. Tell us quickly how that works.
Yeah, so they basically they have batches of test ballots that they go through and they mark, right? And then they run them through the machines. And if the machine comes up with a different tally than what they should have for that, then they know that something isn't working right. And Wake County is fortunate in that there's two people there on staff who are actually qualified, certified technicians for the machines, so they can actually fix them on site without having to call in somebody to come and do it from regional headquarters. But no machine is allowed to be put out until it's gone through extensive logic and accuracy testing to make sure that it's reading the ballots correctly, that it's spitting out the correct results. And then that gets a sticker. Basically, it's sealed, and that seal is not to be broken. It's not to be opened because the seal just basically tells you that it has not been opened and tampered with until it gets to the voting location.
Yeah, and we're going to wrap it up here, but I do want to share with people. A lot of this conspiracy theory stuff works off of anecdote, right? Right. And there's a lot of room for anecdote when 2.7 million, we'll probably eclipse that this election. It's not even that great turnout, but you do anything 2.7 million times, there's going to be a story or two. And it feels like people were in our bubbles. Everyone I know voted for this one person. How could their opponent win? Or right. The other side is evil. No way they won without cheating. So it's like a fear. The only thing we have to fear is fear itself situation.
Right.
And then you got con men, con women. They think they can make a buck off that fear. Some of them go far down the rabbit hole. They probably believe what they're selling. I suggest this strategy to people. As you're hearing from someone who has this conspiracy theory about an election, keep a count in your head how many active conspiracies they seem to be describing and a rough idea of how many people would have to be involved to pull it off, keep it secret. And then ask yourself, am I the mark here? Is somebody trying to manipulate me? So that's kind of a final thought from me on election integrity. Either you can feel good about it. Everybody make your own decision. Look, Laura, what kind of final thought you got for us?
I would just say to be kind and be nice to your election officials, right? Most of these folks are your friends and neighbors. That's the people who work these. I mean, they do get paid a little bit of money, but believe me, nobody gets paid enough to put up with what some of them are having to put up with right now. So they are human beings. They are failsafe after failsafe in this system. But as Chris Krebs said, who was the head of election security under President Trump, the weakest link is the human. It's the user, right? So there's going to be human errors from time to time. Somebody's name will get screwed up with somebody else's name, and their ballot will be checked off, and it'll look like it looked like they voted, and somebody will say, somebody stole my ballot, when it turns out it's just human error. It's clerical error, So just something to keep in mind. There are human errors, and the system is designed to catch them. That's why it has all these different ways for those people to vote provisionally, for example. So we can figure those things out after the fact. But don't believe what you hear from some of these candidates who say you can't count anything that comes in after election day. That's ridiculous. Yes, you can, and we do, and that is normal. So that's part of North Carolina law. And so, just take it all with a grain of salt.
All right. Appreciate your time, Laura. I love the advice. Get out there and vote and be kind while you're doing it.
That's right.
Folks at home, thanks for listening. Thanks for listening to the WRAL Daily Download, making us part of your morning routine. You should also sign up for the morning briefing newsletter. It's a daily email waiting in your inbox every morning. Got triangle news, events, headlines, get you ready for your day. Sign up for that at WRAL.com/newsletter. Thank you for your time. If you haven't voted, go vote.